Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. On behalf of Building America's Future, I'd like to welcome you to the first event of our America's Future Tour, our policy series to address some of the most pressing and important issues of our time. The mission of Building America's Future is to inform and empower Americans to take ownership of our country's policy direction and demand that our government at all levels enact policy reforms to improve the lives of Americans and make America's future strong. Today, we are discussing the growing threat that China poses to America. As a thought leader on this topic, with deep experience in national security and international economic policy, we look forward to hearing from Dave McCormick on his perspective and how the U.S. should address this issue now and in the future. And there's no one more fitting to introduce this topic and our keynote speaker than the 27th Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. A native Pennsylvanian, West Point graduate, and highly decorated military veteran, he has held senior roles in the private sector focused on government and international affairs. And he is a national security and defense policy expert, having served at the highest levels of government, ultimately becoming the Secretary of the Army in 2017 and the 27th Secretary of Defense in 2019. Please welcome Secretary Mark Esper.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Catherine. That was really wonderful. And welcome, everybody. Everybody having a good day today?
Yes.
All right, good. A little bit chipper audience than I expected. It's lovely weather outside here today in Philadelphia, so glad we could bring you in. And now we're going to give you a heavy dose of policy today. So look, it's great to be here to introduce my old friend, a good friend, David McCormick. He is a man of extraordinary character and integrity who is the best thing to happen to this great state, this wonderful Commonwealth, in a long, long, long time. That's right. You're getting the cues. That's encouraging. Now, look, I suppose many of you are wondering why I, a former Secretary of Defense, am standing here and why I am introducing Dave. It's not just the fact that he promised me a cheesesteak from Delisandro's. But it's simple. Dave and I have been friends and colleagues now for many, many years. We run in some of the same circles, share many of the same friends and interests. Our spouses know one another. And look, Dave and I have also worked together on many critical national issues during our time in Washington, D.C. And more importantly, I believe I know the true Dave McCormick because I understand him on another level, a deeper one that precedes our friendship, and frankly, one that goes back over 5 decades, believe it or not. How? Because our personal stories and humble upbringings really mirror one another. We both followed similar paths in life, you see. We both grew up in small Pennsylvania towns. I was born in Uniontown, PA, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Sorry, Eagles fans, although you guys have a better record than we do this year. And Dave was raised in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, where his father served as president of then Bloomsburg State College. In fact, if you're ever on Jeopardy and the topic is Pennsylvania Keystone State Notables, and the panel turns around and the answer says the McCormick family, just remember this one thing. The answer is what family traces its lineage back 7 generations in the Keystone State, and that's the McCormick family. Now, we were both inspired by Ronald Reagan, the Gipper's solid conservative credentials, his belief in peace through strength, and our 40th president's optimistic view of America as a shining city on a hill resonated deeply within us. We both went to West Point. I graduated in 1986, and David a year later as a distinguished alum. We were both paratroopers and fought in the Gulf War for our country, returning home after several months from the sands of the Middle East. So you can see I have a pretty good idea of who Dave McCormick really is based on my sense of those formative years in his life. A combat vet, a West Point grad, a Pennsylvanian through and through. And the best news of all, he's the same person in private that you see in public. And that says a lot about a man. Now, you're supposed to clap right there as well. There we go. You guys are a quick study audience. In the 1990s, however, our paths diverged a little bit. Our trajectories took a different direction, ways that further developed, refined, and revealed Dave's skills, character, passions, and leadership. After retiring from the Army at his rank of captain, Dave earned his Ph.D. in international relations at Princeton University and began his career in business. He rose quickly, becoming CEO of a tech startup that employed hundreds of Pennsylvanians and was quite successful. From there, he was called to service in government, first as Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House, and later as an undersecretary in the Treasury Department. Most recently, Dave led one of the largest investment firms in the world. As for me, I spent a few more years in the Army after the Gulf War. In my last job, I served as a war planner at the Pentagon, focused on Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China. After that, I worked on Capitol Hill, where I managed a broad range of national security issues, with a focus once again on China's rise and ambitions. I then served for 2 years as a Senate-appointed commissioner on the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission, which I tell you, took a tough and critical approach to China's bad behavior. And I was later employed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where I ran an institute that sought to clamp down on China's theft of our intellectual property. A staggering communist effort that robbed our economy and America's entrepreneurs of thousands and thousands of jobs and hundreds and billions of dollars annually. And as Secretary of the Army and later Secretary of Defense, I pursued a national defense strategy that called out China as the greatest strategic threat facing our country today and indeed in this 21st century. Now, why am I walking you through the highlights of my career on this important day for Dave McCormick? It's simple. I hope you've concluded the obvious, that I am a clear-eyed, unabashed, unapologetic China hawk. And guess what? So is Dave McCormick. Dave is well aware of the threat that the Chinese Communist Party presents to America's security, America's prosperity, and America's way of life. It's more than just spy balloons racing across the United States, communist police stations being set up in our largest cities, Chinese-funded Confucius institutes spreading propaganda at our colleges, TikTok peddling disinformation to our youth, Beijing buying up our farmland and spy rings in America's tech hubs. It goes on and on and on, as if that's not enough. No. In addition to all that, Dave knows full well that Beijing has assembled the largest military in the world, an arms buildup the likes of which we probably haven't seen since World War II. An ominous thing to consider on this dark day, December 7th, in America's history. And the Chinese Communist Party intends to use it against the United States and our allies if we stand in their way. He also knows that through illegal subsidies, protectionist measures, rampant rule breaking, and strong armed tactics, China built the world's second largest economy at the expense of our own industries, our own companies, and our own workers. And by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, Dave McCormick understands that not only does the CCP intend to push the United States out of the Indo-Pacific, but they also want to displace us as the world's economic and military superpower. In short, China's aim is to be the global hegemon that dictates how the world acts, thinks, and behaves. I don't know about you, but a world dominated by Beijing, a police state that denies its people basic rights, freedoms, and democracy, is not one that I want my children and future grandchildren to grow up in. I can't imagine what that world would be like. Thankfully, our nation has a leader in Dave McCormick who can see that dark future and who is determined to make sure it doesn't happen. Dave is a man of courage and commitment who has always lived by the timeless West Point motto of duty, honor, and country that calls him to action. He knows the seriousness of that constitutional oath he has taken many times to defend our country against all enemies. And importantly, he has developed a strategy to ensure the United States remains the world's preeminent military and economic power, and that China is thwarted in its nefarious efforts to undermine and overtake us. Dave will lay that game plan out in detail here today. As someone who has worked on China issues for over half of my life, and as a Secretary of Defense who implemented my own national defense strategy focused on the CCP, I will tell you that Dave McCormick has a solid plan. And if the great people of this Commonwealth rally around him over the next year and send him to Washington, D.C., then my concerns about the future, my fear of China's rise, my angst about Beijing's ambitions would be lessened. After all, as a global business leader, Dave has witnessed firsthand the CCP's efforts to project power and exert control in key business sectors and supply chains that impact every American. As a former diplomat at the Treasury Department, Dave knows how the CCP leverages its control and influence to gain an advantage across financial markets, foreign economies, and strategic regions. And as a combat veteran and former Deputy National Security Advisor, Dave understands both the military implications of a conflict with China and the consequences if we don't stand up to them. Now, war with China is by no means inevitable. In fact, it is something that we want to deter and avoid. But navigating the complex nature of the threat the United States faces and implementing a plan that keeps us on top requires sound leadership and a thoughtful strategic approach. That's why Dave's extensive experience, proven expertise, and sound judgment in the public and private sectors make him an ideal thought leader and man of action to address all of these matters and more. With that, folks, I'd like to introduce my good friend and fellow traveler, the right person for the right job in the most difficult of times, and a great Pennsylvanian, a great one, who possesses the wisdom, character, and leadership few can match. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave McCormick.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for that incredible introduction. I feel like I should probably just sit down at this point. That was fantastic. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for all being here, and thank you to Building America's Future for hosting this incredible event. And Mark, thank you for your incredible service to our nation. As Mark said, both he and I are Pennsylvanians. We grew up in rural Pennsylvania. In his case, Uniontown. In my case, Bloomsburg, where I played football and wrestled in towns like Shikellamy and Chickashinny and Selinsgrove and North Schuylkill. And the thing we both have in common is that we love Pennsylvania, we love this country, and that drew us both to service. And so it's really an honor to have Mark here today. This is the first in a series of speeches that I'll deliver across our Commonwealth. And I'll talk about the most important challenges facing Pennsylvania and facing the nation, and what we can do about those problems. I call it my Keystone Agenda to Reclaim America. And I'm doing this because ideas and leadership are what matters. And in this critical moment, we all know that Washington is short on both. It's a city full of people who like to talk about problems, but have not shown the ability to get things done. There's a deficit in leadership and ideas that needs to be shaken up. And of all the issues we face, and there are many, none need shaking up more than our relationship with China. Now, we've gathered here on the 82nd anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Today, we face a shadow growing on the Pacific horizon, the Chinese Communist Party. And we cannot be caught by surprise again as we were in 1941. To put it bluntly, China poses the gravest threat to our security and our well-being since the end of World War II. And our nation's leaders, including career politicians like Pennsylvania Senator Bob Casey, have gotten China wrong for more than 2 decades. We're in a contest for our prosperity, for our security, our values, our very way of life. And if we lose, If we lose, we sacrifice the future long promised to my daughters and their children. The Biden administration is taking us on a dangerous path, and today I'm proposing a new one. Based on my experience in government and the private sector, I'll discuss how we can fortify American military and economic strength, and I propose 6 bans, dramatic policy changes to thwart China's aggressive, ambitious behavior and protect our homeland. The overhauling of the U.S.-China relationship is a stark departure from the incrementalism that's preached by Washington bureaucrats. We need decisive action to reestablish American strength, reduce our dependence on China, and build a better future for the American people. This path, and not continued weakness, will make a hot war less likely. Now, just over 33 years ago, I deployed to Saudi Arabia as a member of the 82nd Airborne Division. We were sent to hold the line. Thank you. We were sent to hold the line after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And as my Humvee rumbled through the desert, the Iraqi desert, in Operation Desert Storm, I bore witness to nearly unchallenged American power and triumph. 3 decades later, that American power has ebbed. Our enemies are at the gates, led by the Chinese Communist Party. As we speak, China is propping up Russia and buying Iranian oil so the jihadist regime in Tehran can fund terrorism against Israel and the United States. How did we allow this to happen? To be very blunt, American political and business leaders made a major fundamental mistake. They believed that if we ushered China into the global economy, over time, free trade would lead to the Chinese people being a more free people, and the Communist Party's grip on power would diminish. I saw even back then that this was a dangerously naive hope. As a national security official in the Bush administration, I warned publicly that China's technological ambitions posed a serious threat, and I called for restrictions on technology exports to China. But sadly today, President Xi Jinping's techno-authoritarian regime has proven me right. This is a regime that Republican and Democratic administrations agree is committing genocide against the Uyghurs. A regime that preaches peaceful coexistence while bullying its neighbors and undertaking one of the largest military buildups in history. It's a regime that just a few months ago floated a surveillance balloon over Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Under Xi's leadership, the Chinese Communist Party seeks dominance in East Asia, technological superiority, and eventually to supplant America as the world's superpower. But it isn't just the fight over geopolitics. This is about the kind of world we will pass on to our children. It's about refilling the shop floors in Pittsburgh and ensuring the teenagers in Chester County are protected against the scourge of fentanyl, and they make it home safely for dinner. Last month, many American business leaders, some of whom I know well, gathered in San Francisco to dine with Xi Jinping. At the cost of $40,000 per head, they shared steak at Xi's table and gave the leader of the Chinese Communist Party a standing ovation. In true Biden fashion, he bent over backwards to appease Xi, and all he got for that was empty promises and a photo op. And instead of sending a clear message that U.S.-China relations need to be overhauled, President Biden and our nation's business leaders effectively told Xi, all is well. That was a terrible mistake. When will our leaders learn from the mistakes of the past? China's rise was fueled by the loss of millions of American jobs, including more than 220,000 manufacturing jobs in Pennsylvania alone, because of unfair trade since China joined the World Trade Organization. For 2 decades, under the leadership of Presidents Obama and Biden and Senator Casey, communities across our Commonwealth, including my hometown of Bloomsburg, have been hollowed out. And many of our communities are flooded with fentanyl, sourced primarily from China, which kills more than 4,000 Pennsylvanians each year. And the death and destruction does not stop there. Xi's regime willfully hid the truth on the origins of COVID-19, and as a consequence, 53,000 Pennsylvanians lost their lives. And the resulting shutdown wreaked havoc on the educational development of an entire generation of our children. Now, I first went to China as a young man, and I experienced the generosity of the Chinese people. And since then, I've been to China more than a dozen times as a senior government official, as a businessman. This is one of the reasons I'm uniquely equipped to tackle this challenge. Sadly, the place I traveled to and the China that many visitors saw 2 decades ago is a distant memory. Describing China's current dangerous path gives me no pleasure. It's a unique country with great people, deserving of freedom and prosperity. It's Xi's CCP, the Communist Party, that threatens peace and America's future. And we cannot negotiate our way out of this. Leaders in Washington and in business must finally face up to the fact that China is an adversary that must be checked, not a partner who can be accommodated. Ultimately, we need a clean and decisive departure from America's failed engagement with the CCP. Now, Senator Casey has been in Washington almost 2 decades, since 2007, and has had every opportunity to exercise leadership on behalf of Pennsylvanians to address the significant and growing threat from China. But instead, he's been a rubber stamp for the policies that have weakened America and made us more dependent on China. President Biden and Senator Casey still think about talking with the Chinese as a way of solving our problems, that the CCP can be trusted to cooperate on shared interests, things like healthcare and climate change, issues where working with the Chinese is the equivalent of sitting down with an arsonist after they just threw more gasoline on the fire. As I've said for years, we need sober-minded leadership and clear ideas to ensure America prevails over the long term against the Communist Party. And based on my years of experience with the Chinese, here's what I've learned. The CCP speaks with one language, the language of power. Engaging from a position of weakness will never work. The best way to deter conflict is to ensure that we are strong and we will win. This means we must reverse the erosion of American military strength, get Taiwan the capabilities it needs to defend against the potential Chinese invasion, deploy more forces to deter Xi from attacking our friends, and make historic investments in weapons production and shipbuilding in support of a larger blue water navy. We must also assume the CCP has and will continue to weaponize our dependence against us. As a result, we must build muscle to keep innovating in key technologies while reducing our dependence on China for critical things, critical supply chains. Next, the CCP will never hold up their end of the bargain unless compelled to do so by us. Experience has shown that agreements with the Communist Party are not worth the paper they're written on. When done properly with like-minded nations, free and fair trade can be great for all Americans and make us better off at home. But that's not the case with an adversary like China that doesn't play by the rules. The days of unbridled free trade and investment in China must end, and we need to focus on expanding our economic relationships with trusted partners based on fairness and reciprocity. And finally, the CCP will constantly probe for weakness, both in the United States and among our allies, to undermine us from within. They steal American technology and research. They spy on our military bases, and they promote CCP propaganda at universities through Confucius institutes. We can no longer turn a blind eye to these efforts to undermine the very values and institutions that keep America exceptional. And that's why we need to overhaul the relationship with China through dramatic policy changes in the form of 6 bans to check China's aggressive ambitions. Number 1, stop the unabated flow of Chinese fentanyl ingredients and drug money into the Western Hemisphere. 4,000 deadly overdoses in Pennsylvania each year is a tragedy and an outrage that must not be allowed to continue. We must not tolerate the flow of billions of dollars of fentanyl ingredients and laundered money from China that sustains the movement of deadly drugs into our communities. If China will not do their part, we must use sanctions, intelligence resources, military interdictions at sea, and all the tools at our disposal to make it difficult, if not impossible, to produce fentanyl with ingredients originating in China. Now, I can hear the critics right now saying, this is too extreme. Good, because I think this fentanyl epidemic is extreme, and it's time for serious measures to stop it. The Biden administration wants to keep talking about this problem, and I want to crush it. Number 2, revoke the benefits of permanent normal trade relations for China. The decision by President Clinton to invite China into the World Trade Organization, the WTO, gave China preferential access to the U.S. market. But instead of following the rules and meeting its trade obligations like other responsible nations, what did China do? They cheated. They stole. They took advantage of weak American leadership. And it's time to get tough. Congress must revoke China's permanent normal trade relations status, and the United States must advocate for China's removal from the WTO. Now, Bob Casey won't vote for this. I will. Going forward, we must chart a new path on trade that focuses on shifting critical supply chains to more reliable trading partners, or even better, bring them back home. We can do this while protecting American farmers from Chinese economic coercion. This is a massive project. It will require leaders in Washington who understand this challenge. Number 3, stop making America even more dependent on lithium batteries and solar panels imported from China. It's absurd. It's absurd that the Biden administration's green climate crusade is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into things like electric vehicles and solar panels that make the U.S. even more dependent on China. It might as well be a direct transfer from Pennsylvanians' bank accounts to the CCP. Just think about this. Biden's own Energy Department admits that China controls 61% of global lithium refining critical to electric vehicles. And we depend on China for solar panels which use polysilicon sourced from a region where the CCP imprisons the Uyghurs. I won't accept it. We should stop being dependent on lithium batteries and solar panels from China, and whenever possible, make them at home. Being dependent, right? We are growing dependent on China. Being dependent on China for advanced energy technology repeats the very same mistake that we made and learned from with semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. Number 4, end any United States investment in or trade that supports the CCP's national security state. American innovation and money and hard work must no longer underwrite the CCP's efforts to become the world's leading superpower. It's unconscionable to me to consider the possibility that U.S. dollars would fund a military buildup that could one day be deployed against Pennsylvania's sons and daughters. We must now presume that Chinese companies seeking U.S. financing or technology will become partners to China's military and security services, whether willingly or not. And that's why I've called on Congress to establish a clear outbound investment regime that cuts off U.S. investment in all technologies in China critical to national security, and in those companies that work with the People's Liberation Army. All publicly traded companies and investment funds should also disclose their investments and exposure in China in public filings. And I will lead on this issue. Number 5, remove China from the World Health Organization. It seems so obvious. The recklessness of the Chinese Communist Party and its Wuhan Institute of Virology unleashed COVID-19 on the world. They then deprived the United States and our public health institutions crucial warning so we could prepare for the pandemic. They refused to provide transparency on its potential origin. And they co-opted international organizations like the WHO to spread their COVID propaganda. And every community in America, every one of them, everyone in this audience was affected by it. From those we lost, to those who lost their jobs, to years of education that were lost, to lockdowns. And even today, China's leaders continue to ignore their WHO obligations. I won't have it, I won't stop until China is removed from the World Health Organization. Number 6, ban strategic purchases of American land by the CCP. The pandemic and what we're seeing right now in Ukraine have made clear the importance of food security to our economy. Our nation's farmers and ranchers give us the ability to feed ourselves and many countries around the world. This is a strategic asset, and it's a source of independence, and we can never allow that to change. All significant purchases of American land by Chinese nationals or Chinese companies, as well as purchases near military bases and critical infrastructure, should undergo a national security review. And I will defend our agricultural industry and our homeland from the CCP. Now, I've laid out a lot of policies today, but I want to make sure you leave with 2 things front of mind: leadership and ideas. Leadership and ideas. Senator Casey offers neither. He'll ignore the serious ideas we've discussed today. He's going to say McCormick himself did business in China. He's going to say Bridgewater did business in China, and it did. These attacks are predictable, but the real question is who has the will and the strength to act. Therefore, I have 6 questions for Senator Casey. Senator, will you stop the unabated flow of illicit Chinese-based fentanyl? Sir, will you revoke the benefits of permanent normal trade relations for China? Senator, will you stop America from becoming even more dependent on lithium batteries and solar panels imported from China? Senator Casey, will you end any U.S. investment on trade that supports the Chinese Communist Party national security state? Senator, will you work to remove China from the World Health Organization? And finally, will you ban strategic purchases of American land by the CCP? Now, I suspect Senator Casey will not respond because he's more focused on rhetoric than concrete results. In recent months, with his re-election looming, he started to talk tough on China. But I've learned on the wrestling mat and on the battlefield and in business that talking tough and being tough are 2 different things. The senator has proven for 2 decades he won't stand firm against the CCP or stand up for a strong and resilient America. He has dithered while China has moved aggressively. He has failed, and he should be replaced. It's going to take someone who has seen and experienced the way the Chinese operate to get this done. It's going to take someone who knows exactly the mistakes that American business and American government officials have made in China and who has learned from those mistakes. I know exactly how hard this is going to be, and I'm uniquely qualified to meet this challenge. If I'm given the opportunity and the honor to serve, I won't wait. I will work on day 1 to confront the CCP, to enact these 6 bans, and to fight for America's future. Thank you very much for being here today.